In this video, I'm going to briefly illustrate the meaning of interactions between continuous and binary variables. So, these years of education would be our continuous variables or interval ratio variables, and we have two ratio categories here. So, this would be our binary variable. So, as you can see from here, if we try to estimate what's the income for those from ratio category 0 with 0 years of education, this is how the formula looks. And we can also estimate the income for those from ratio category 0 with 1 year of education, 2 years of education, and so on. We can just copy the formula over, and we can also estimate what's the income like for those from ratio category 1 with no schooling. This is how the formula looks like. And we can estimate the income for those from ratio category 1 with 1 year of schooling, with 2 years of schooling, and so on. We can just copy the formula over from this cell. And then we try to estimate how income change for those from ratio category 0 when they acquire an additional years of schooling. And this is how income change. Maybe their income changed by $2,420. Let's say this is income per $1,000. And we can just copy the formula over. And we can also estimate how income is going to change for those from ratio category 1 when they acquire 1 year of schooling. This is how the formula looks like. And we can just copy over. And as you can see, for those from ratio category 1, their income changed by over $3,200. The increase in income with additional years of schooling acquired for this ratio group is greater than the increase of income for this ratio group if they attain an additional years of schooling. And we can also estimate how income or how ratio differences for income is going to look like for those with 0 years of education. This is the formula. And we can also estimate how ratio differences for income is going to look like for those with 1 year of schooling, 2 years of schooling. In fact, we can just copy the formula over. As you can see, the ratio differences in income is going to increase. The gaps in income is going to increase for this between these two ratio groups when they attain additional years of schooling. As we can see from here, the gaps are going to increase. And we can also assess how ratio differences in income is going to look like when we move from 0 to 1 years of schooling, from 1 to 2 years of schooling, from 2 to 3 years of schooling. And this is what we get if you plug in the formulas. If you type the formula here and when you just copy over, this is what you get. So as you can see from this worksheet, this difference in income by the years of education, the difference in income for this racial category when they attain more years of schooling is going to correspond to this coefficient here. Things look different when we have interaction terms. This coefficient no longer refers to the years of education per se. And for this racial group, when they acquire more years of schooling, their income is going to change by slightly over $3,200. And this corresponds to this plus this. We get the same number, right? So this is the meaning of interaction between continuous and binary or dummy variable. As you can see, for those from this racial group, if they acquire more years of schooling, they are going to experience more increase in income. It seems that this racial group is better off if they go for more years of schooling. So, if we want to look at how racial differences in income changes with additional years of schooling, this is what we do. For those with no education, the racial gaps in income is about $1,500. For those with 1 year of schooling, the gaps in income is slightly over $2,300. For those with 2 years of schooling, the gaps in income is slightly over $3,100, and so on and so forth. So, if we want to find out how the gaps in income between racial groups change over time, you go to another row, you plug in the formula here. So as you can see, racial differences in income with additional years of schooling acquired, they change about $796. This corresponds to these coefficients. So if we want to graph this, we can see it's quite obvious that those from racial group 1 is better off. If they go for more schooling, they are going to experience more increase in income compared to those from racial group 0. Are we clear? Okay, now we are done with two-way interaction. Let's do something about three-way interaction. Because any worksheet or any piece of paper, you can think of a worksheet like a piece of paper, only has 2 dimensions, right? The rows and columns. So if we want to present 3 pieces of information or 3 pieces of information on a 2-dimensional plane or worksheet, we have 3 pieces of information. We have years of education, years of work experience, and race category. This is how we are going to do it. We are going to set this worksheet specifically for those with no schooling and how their income changed with increased years of work experience. So we can estimate what's the income for those from race category 0 with no work experience. We can estimate that by plugging in this formula. And What's the estimate income for those from race 0 with 1 year of work experience? What's the estimate income for those from race category 0 with 2 years of work experience, and so on and so forth? We can just copy the formula over. And we can also do the same thing for this ratio group. So, for race category 1, when you look at this formula, we have to take this into consideration because they are assigned with a code of 1. So, we have to multiply by 1 in here. And this 0 here and 0 here means that they have no schooling. This is how we apply the formula. And we can just copy and paste the formula. And if we want to see how the income for a particular racial group change with additional years of work experience, this is what we do. This is the formula we use. We subtract this from this. Look at the formula. So, as we can see, for those from race category 0 with no education, if they work an additional years, their income is going to increase by $965. And for those from racial category 0, if they work 2 years, even though they have no education, they haven't been to school, their income is also going to increase by $965, and we can just copy this formula over. And for those from race category 1 with no education, if they acquire 1 year experience, their income is also going to change by $965. And for those from race category 1 with no schooling, if they work an additional years, their income is still going to increase by $965. And these correspond to these coefficients. As you can see, because of the involvement of interaction terms, this coefficient no longer refers to years of work experience. These coefficients now refers to how the income for a particular racial group with no education change when they acquire additional years of work experience. Are we clear? And if you want to see how the racial gaps in income, if these two racial groups have no education, we want to see how the racial gaps in income change with additional years of experience acquired. This is what we do. This is the formula here. We subtract this from this and we get this. The same thing for here. We can just copy the formula over. And these correspond to these coefficients. And because of interaction terms is involved in this equation here, these coefficients no longer refers to those from racial category 1. These coefficients now refers to the racial gaps in income for those with no education. How the racial gaps in income change with additional years of work experience acquired. So, in this example, we control by the years of education. Everybody has no schooling here. Everybody from these two racial groups have no schooling. We want to see how the racial gaps in income change when these two groups of people acquire more work experience. Are we clear? Okay. Now, everybody we filter our data set by only selecting out all those with 1 year of schooling. We do the same thing again. We estimate the income for those from this racial category with 1 year of schooling with no experience, and we estimate what's the income is going to be like for those from racial group 0 with 1 year of schooling. We just copy the formula over. And we can also estimate the income for those from this racial group with 1 year of schooling. As you can see, we multiply by 1 here, even though it's not necessary. But to be clear, for this example, because we have 3 interactions, so we want to be clear, we write it out in our formula. So this is the estimated income for those from this racial group with 1 year of schooling. And this is the this is the estimated income for those from this racial group with 1 year of schooling and 1 year of work experience. We can just copy the formula over, right? And we want to see how the income changed for those with 1 year of education from this racial group. We just subtract this from this and copy the formula over. And we also want to see how the income changed for racial group 1 with 1 year of schooling. How the income is going to change for this racial group with 1 year of schooling if they acquire additional years of work experience. We plug in the formula here. We subtract this from this. We copy the formula over. And as you can see, these correspond to this coefficient. And once again, as is the case with this example with no schooling, these coefficients no longer refers to the years of work experience because interaction terms are involved. In this case, 3-way interaction terms are involved. So these coefficients refers to how the income is going to change for this racial group with 1 year of schooling if they gain additional years of work experience, and how the income is going to change for this racial group with 1 year of schooling if they gain additional years of work experience. And as you can see, these coefficients correspond to the sum of this and this. So things work differently when we have interaction terms. And we also want to see how the racial gaps in income change with additional years of schooling. As we can see, the racial gaps in income increase over time with additional years of schooling. So, as we can see, there are some kind of racial inequality manifested by this fictitious data set, right? And if we subtract this from this, we get this. The same thing for here. We just copy the formula over, and we want to see how the racial gaps in income change by taking education and years of work experience into account. This is what we do, and the numbers are the same. This is also the change of the change. How the change in racial gap in income changed over time. hope I'm making sense here. So this corresponds to this coefficient, the three-way interaction. I hope I'm making sense. Okay, let's go to another scenario. In here, we filter out those from this ratio group and this ratio group with 2 years of schooling. We want to see how their estimated income change with additional years of work experience acquired. We plug in the same formula, but in this case, we multiply by 2 because it's 2 years of schooling in here. And we multiply this by the work experience, which is going to change when we move from column to column. We can just copy the formula over. And here, you got to be more careful. We multiply by 2 in these coefficients because it's 2 years of schooling. And we multiply this by the years of work experience. We have to take this ratio group into consideration because they are coded as 1. And we multiply the two-way interaction by 2 because 2 years of education is involved. So we multiply this by 2. And we also multiply the three-way interaction by 2 because of 2 years of schooling. We just copy the formula over. And we want to see how the income change for this ratio group with 2 years of schooling if they acquire additional years of work experience. We just plug in this formula. If we want to see how income change for this ratio group coded as 1 with 2 years of education, if they gain additional years of work experience, we just plug in this formula and copy the formula over. And once again, you see that this change in income for this ratio group correspond to this coefficient. Once again, this coefficient no longer refers to years of experience because 3 ways of interaction are involved. And this change in income for this ratio group with 2 years of education is about 1300, right? This is how we get. This is the sum of this, the years of work experience, by 2 multiplied by this. And if we want to see how the ratio gaps in income change over time with additional years of experience acquired for everybody with only 2 years of schooling, we plug in the formula like the previous worksheet. We plug in the formula. We just copy the formula over. And if we want to see how the change in income change over time, there are 2 changes involved here. We plug in the formula. And these correspond to this multiplied by 2. Given and take the rounding. Are we clear? And let's say now we only select those from this ratio group and this ratio group with 8 years of education. And we want to estimate how their income changed over time if they gain additional years of work experience. We plug in the same formula. And for those assigned to ratio category 1, as you can see, the formula is more complicated. We multiply by 8 here. And here we only multiply by 8 once for years of schooling. Here we multiply by 8 several times. The same for here. And this is more simple, right? And we just copy the formulas over. And if we want to see for these two racial groups with 8 years of schooling, if they acquire additional years of work experience, how would their income change? We just plug in the formula. We subtract this from this to get this, and this correspond to these coefficients. And if we copy the formula over, we find out that they are all the same. And if we want to see how the income for this racial group is going to change with additional years of work experience acquired, we subtract this from this, we get this. And this equals to these coefficients plus 8 multiplied by these coefficients because of 8 years of schooling involved. And if we want to see how the racial gaps in income change with additional years of work experience acquired, we plug in the formula here. We subtract this from this. And if we want to find out the change of the change, or how the change in racial gaps in income change over time, we plug in this formula. And this is what we get. And this also equals to this multiplied by 8. Are we clear?